Mars, Moon, Colonization, Spacecraft. Latest, Robert Zimmerman, here at the Leak Project. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're having a fantastic day. This is Rex Bear with Leak Project, and we have guest Robert Zimmerman with us. Now, Robert is an expert in privatization of spaceflight. We get in deep into the possibilities of where rockets could be within the next 10 years. Heck, where they're even at now. The Falcon 9 rocket, how Elon Musk has literally revolutionized the industry. Now, several years ago even, not too long ago, you guys, there were just a few key players, Russians and Americans, that charged billions and billions and billions of dollars for rockets and space travel. Very limited. Now, there's over 30 companies trying to beat Elon at his own game. It used to be a rocket launch would cost anywhere from $100 million to $500 million to launch a single rocket. Elon has changed the industry to now they cost about $62 million bucks. This has given him billions in contracts. We discuss new technologies that are being used, like the Merlin engine. We also talk about new fuel sources that could be used in some of these rockets. A new engine called the Raptor that uses methane instead of kerosene. Now, one of the key reasons to use methane, Robert says, is because it will be much more readily available in space. Have you heard of Blue Origin? Founded by the owner of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, this is an inner orbit rocket. Now, we talked about how long it would take to currently get to Mars, and when the orbits line up, about every 2 years, you can send a payload to Mars that'll take anywhere from 6 to 8 months. We also talked about how Russia seems to have some type of curse when landing on Mars or Phobos. They made it to Venus, but they can't land on Mars. He doesn't think this is an alien attack. He thinks that this is just a curse that they have. Who knows? The New Horizons is getting ready to fly past something beyond the Kuiper Belt. BehindTheBlack.com. Also pick up your copy of Genesis, the story of Apollo 8. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/ClandestineTimeLord. Become a contributing member at Leak Project. For $10, you'll get access to over 300 full-feature podcasts, downloadable, streamable, commercial-free, and your contributions greatly help Leak Project. Also pick up your high-resolution vinyl decal for $10. Wake people up. Be the change you want to see. I'm sure you guys remember the recent SpaceX launch of the Falcon 9 rocket that blew up on the landing pad. And there was some video footage of, looks like a bird that flies past it at the same time it blows up. And some people thought that that was some type of either alien technology or other sorts of technology that caused the rocket to blow up. I watched the video footage and it just looked like a bird to me, but it could have been a really pissed off crow. Who knows?
Well, that accident that occurred on September 1st is really, it's rocket science. So things go wrong. And before we even talk about it, we should at least lay the groundwork of what's going on in the space industry right now. The rocket that exploded was the Falcon 9 rocket, which is being built by SpaceX. And that's a company that was founded by Elon Musk. And Elon Musk was one of the founders of PayPal. And he did that in the 90s as a very young man. They sold the company, and he suddenly found himself with a lot of cash on hand, and didn't know what to do with it. Well, actually, he didn't know what to do with it because he was always a space cadet. He wanted to go to Mars. He's always wanted to go to Mars. So he decided, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to build the first private scientific planetary mission to another planet. We'll go to Mars. And he researched, and he found with the money he had from selling PayPal, he could afford to build a spacecraft, a planetary probe that would go to Mars. But he discovered he could not afford to launch it, because the rocket industry at that time, prior to the aughts, the first decade of this century, was a very dead industry. You had about 4 or 5 companies worldwide, some of them nationalized, the Russians and in Europe, and then 2 companies in the United States that had actually formed a partnership, so there was only one company here, really. And none of them were interested in competing. They all had their little niche markets. and they were happy, like the American companies were quite happy to selling their launches to the military and to NASA and not compete for the commercial market. And the Europeans grabbed most of the commercial market with the Russians grabbing the rest. And they were just happy not to do any innovation, any competition, not to lower prices. The people they sold to, mostly the government was their main business, was not interested in lowering the prices at all. And the commercial market was dying because no one could afford to, just like Elon Musk discovered, no one could afford the launch price. So Musk says, a light bulb went off in his head. He said, you know what? I'm a good businessman. Why don't I just simply start my own rocket company and make money because I can undercut all these people? There's definitely you can cut the cost here, and that's what he did. And he developed the Falcon 9 rocket, and he developed a business practice that reduced the cost enormously. And the result is, and I'm talking about really enormously, a launch before Musk showed up would cost anywhere from $100 million to almost $500 million. That's for the rocket. And Musk shows up and he says, okay, and he puts it right on his webpage, our launches cost you $62 million. So almost half, even at the lowest price, he was cheaper. And that includes beating the Russians to the price as well. And the Russians have very low labor costs, so they really could have been cheaper. What happens? Within 5 years, he's got almost $1 billion in contracts. In addition to that, NASA hires him to build cargo to bring to ISS. And he develops a Dragon capsule, developed it right from the start to be manned. But it's doing cargo. And at the time, NASA decided to hire 2 companies to do this. Another company, Orbital ATK, was hired to send up its capsule as well to bring cargo to ISS. And the result is that Elon Musk's decision to compete is forced every other one of those other companies that for decades was not trying to lower prices, were not interested in innovation or creativity or trying to find a way to do this better. Suddenly, they have to find ways to cut their costs, and they have to find ways to do it creatively. One of the ways that Musk's company has really sent fire throughout the entire industry was his decision 4 years ago to make the first stage rockets of his Falcon 9 reusable. And the way to do that is to recover them, was to have them land vertically at the launch pad after launch. And everybody told him, and decades I heard this said, for decades, that was impractical. You wouldn't have enough fuel to do it. You wouldn't be able to get your payloads into orbit. Even if you did it, the first stage wouldn't be usable again. The stress from launch would make it not workable. And he said, well, I'm going to do it. And guess what? They did it. It was historical. It was a big deal. He made history doing this. And in doing so, he demonstrated, one, that it can work. You can get your payloads into orbit even if you use the fuel to return the first stage. And you can reduce the price of launches anywhere from 10 to 30% over his already cheapest prices. Now, what that's done to the whole launch industry is that by lowering the cost, it means that companies that before could not afford to put payloads in orbit now suddenly can. And so your customer base has suddenly grown. And the result of that is that there are now about 30 companies trying to do what Elon Musk did. And this is not the old players. These are new companies trying to do exactly what Elon Musk did, but beat him at his own game. And the result is a revitalized launch industry, mostly revitalized by Americans who are pushing very hard to be creative. This is really old-fashioned Yankee ingenuity. And be creative and come up with better ways to do things that will be less costly, and therefore we can accomplish more in space. And we do it with profit all along the way. Now, having laid that groundwork, we come to SpaceX's launch on September 1st. The rocket's on the launch pad. They're doing a dress rehearsal countdown. They do this routinely and have been doing this routinely since they started the Falcon 9 back almost now 8 years ago, where they do, prior to launch, a few days before launch, they do a dress rehearsal countdown where they they fuel the tanks, and they get to T-minus 0, and they fire the tanks for maybe 5 seconds, 3 seconds, and they're done. And then they know everything works, and they unfuel the rocket, and they put it back, they put it down, and they say, okay, we'll launch now on the official date a few days later. Well, they were in the process of fueling the rocket, when out of nowhere, it goes boom, and it explodes on the launch pad. And they have now pinpointed that the explosion took place with a breach in a helium tank in the second stage. Now, the helium is not a fuel, it's not a propellant. What the helium is used for is to keep the tank, the oxygen tank specifically, pressurized as the oxygen is being pumped into the system. And so, think of it as you have a tank, you're pumping fuel very fast into the engine. And so you have to be able to make sure that fuel, that in this case oxidized oxygen, keeps getting pumped in. And so what you do is you need to put some kind of other gas in the tank to keep the pressure up. And so they use helium. Helium doesn't interfere with the process, and they can just pump it in. Well, somehow that tank breached. And in the process of breaching, it caused other other fuels to mix. They shouldn't, and they went boom, and the whole thing went up. They're investigating it now. They don't yet know what happened. They actually are looking at every possibility. One of the possibilities they actually did look at was this sabotage? Did someone try to, nearby fire a sniper fire or laser at the rocket to blow it up? They pretty much dismissed that now. And it doesn't make much sense logically based on what happened. So now they're trying to figure out, why did the tank explode? Why did that helium tank get breached? So I'm talking about a very big breach. It wasn't like a little leak. It suddenly it failed. The whole tank failed aggressively, and that caused everything else to fall apart. And so they have to figure that out. In order to figure that out, they can't launch again until they figure it out. They keep saying they're going to be able to launch by November, which is very confident on their part. And we'll have to see. We have to underline, Rex, above all, that this is rocket science. That's
I love the way you put that.
In the language, if something's hard to do, you say, well, it's rocket science. Well, guess what? This is rocket science, and things go wrong. SpaceX rockets, they've had 2 failures since they introduced the Falcon 9 rocket. That percentage of launches for a new rocket is not out of the ordinary. So anyone who knows the industry very well is not terribly concerned. And in fact, all the customers, that's $1 billion worth of contracts they have with commercial companies, no one at this point has backed out. They have no worries. They understand this is how it works.
Well, I'm looking at a picture of the SpaceX rocket right now, and it's actually on its side. It's in a warehouse, and you can see the underneath of it, essentially the bottom thruster system. It just looks absolutely incredible, and to see it close up like this, or at least as far as the details on the image, it gives it another perspective. I can't just imagine, and the way you present this about how this industry with the Yankee essentially is just mind-boggling. I mean, think about it for a minute. This is an industry that used to be controlled by just a few key players, and now you've got people that can start doing things out of their garage, and who knows what it's going to be like 10 years from now, 20 years from now. NASA's got a great talk on the space elevator concept. If you go to SSERVI, which stands for Solar System Exploration Research Viral Institute, it has some neat information on the theory of the space elevator concept. I think that's pretty neat too, but probably a lot further down the road than some of this rocket technology. Could I ask a question about the fuels and stuff with the Falcon 9 real quick?
Sure. Whatever question you want. Go ahead. I should insert, by the way, the space elevator is a cool idea. So is the ideas of talking about terraforming Mars and, terraforming the moon and setting up colonies there. In fact, Musk gave a speech just a few weeks ago, just like 2 weeks ago, big speech, big press on it, where he talked about how he's developing a new rocket that's going to be powerful enough that they can start sending hundreds of people to Mars routinely. And what we all have to understand here is really what's important right now is learning how to build cheap rockets. Everything else that we're talking about, the other kind of stuff, is really in the future. If we don't get the cheap rockets, we don't get any of that. We need to first learn how to build rockets competitively and cheaply, so that it's there, and reliably, so that you can get your payloads into orbit. And if that happens, then what you're going to have is interplanetary spaceships going to be built privately for tourists and for private business people who want to mine the planets and the asteroids. So the first thing is find out how to do it cheaply, and that's what Musk's company has been working on. More importantly, now the question about the fuels. Go ahead. What exactly do you want to know?
Sure. Now I don't know the exact formula, and I don't necessarily need to, but there's so many different possibilities as far as energy sources now. Even if you look at some of the things that are used for smaller vehicles like cars, I saw these basically go-karts in India that were ran off of air being compressed in these motors. They were compressing air essentially. And Stanton Friedman is a big, I think he really pushes like nuclear type fuel in some of these rockets. And some people say, hey, that's a real bad idea. So I'm just wondering where the future of the fuel itself is going to be with these rockets, because I think that in and of itself could be huge. I mean, if they could find a key break or something that just goes to the next level with the fuel source, then that could change the whole thing.
Well, you're giving me a question, Rex, that I have never gotten from a radio host before, and it's a cool question because it's getting into the engineering here, and something that I think many audiences would be interested in. Most rocket engines most of the time, they use kerosene and oxygen. The jet fuel could use some variation of kerosene or some oil-based gasoline that then mixes with the oxygen in the atmosphere in the jet fuel to make the explosion that makes the jet work. In a rocket rocket, you can't use the oxygen, at least at this moment in time. We don't have the engineering to use the oxygen in the atmosphere. So what they do is they have the oxygen, and then they have some other propellant, and that propellant usually has been kerosene for a lot of practical reasons. Not always. They use other types of fuel as well for other purposes. But for the main engines of most rockets, those are the two main fuels. Then you design your engine a variety of different ways, and there have been many different engines built over the decades by the Russians, by the different American companies, by the Chinese, by the Europeans, and they have different levels of efficiency. The engine that SpaceX built for its Falcon 9 rocket, they call it the Merlin engine. This is an example, by the way, of how a private enterprise does things smart. Rather than build different engines for different stages of the rocket, they build one engine, the Merlin engine, and then they use it on all the stages. So they don't have to redesign multiple engines. It saves a lot of money, and it makes things go faster, and you get built quicker, and you have a much more efficient operation. So they have the Merlin engine, that's kerosene-based. What Elon Musk talked about a few weeks ago with his rocket that he wants to use to send hundreds of people to Mars is using a new engine that SpaceX is developing, which they call the Raptor engine. And the Raptor engine does not use kerosene, it uses methane. And similarly, there's another company on the horizon here called Blue Origin. That's a company that was founded by Jeff Bezos. He's the guy who developed Amazon. And he is, just like Elon Musk, he did an internet-based business, made billions of dollars, and he wants to use that money for something that really interests him. So he built a rocket company, his own rocket company, and he's developing an engine for his orbital rocket. He has not built an orbital rocket yet. He's got a suborbital rocket, which he's been testing and reflying and reusing, landing it vertically, called the New Shepard. Well, that doesn't have engines that are super duper powerful enough to get you into orbit, but they're developing an engine which they call the BE-4. Not a very romantic name, but either way, that engine is designed also to be powerful enough to power an orbital rocket, which they'll call the New Glenn, named after John Glenn. And that engine's being developed right now, and yes, it also uses methane. Now, Elon Musk described one of his reasons for wanting to use methane with oxygen was that methane is going to be available in space. And so if you carry your fuel with you, your methane, but if you need to get refueled, it's going to be much more practical eventually for colonies in space to be able to process and make available methane fuel for rocket engines if the engines use methane. Kerosene, it won't be possible. Kerosene is oil-based, and you've got to have oil, which means you've got to have, once in the past, maybe dinosaurs. But methane is something you find routinely in the solar system on many planets. And so that's what's his thinking. There's another reason. There are design considerations for a methane engine, and that's what they're trying to do with the Raptor engine. They call it, they call it full flow, and that means that it simplifies the engine design so that you don't need as many fuel pumps. The engine can be smaller in size, which means it's more efficient in operation. But in the end, it has 3 times the power, the thrust of the kerosene engines. So when you do that, you suddenly have a much more powerful engine that maybe can fit into the same space that a smaller engine, the previous less powerful engine, could fit. Which means once again, you're faced with you're presenting the possibility of a rocket that can pretty much put more payload into orbit for the same price. And that, once again, brings us back to what I said before. We've got to build cheap rockets so we have the capability of doing more in space for affordable money. And that's where so I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. And I'm also wondering about this colonization of Mars. I mean, they're even attempting to make a reality show out of it now. And these reality shows are obviously hysterical most of the time, but it would be neat to see.
I can give you specifics on that. I'll tell you something right now, Rex. That specific reality show is a total fraud. So let me put that right out front. It's
Bingo.
A total fraud. All right?
I didn't know that.
That was the case. Yeah. What they did there is they made a big announcement. We've been asking for applications for people who want to go on a one-way journey to Mars, and so a lot of people fill the applications out, and then they made a big deal about those applications, but they have literally no money for anything. It was a public relations stunt for the attempt to raise money to do a television show had nothing to do with actually sending people to Mars. And as it is right now, they haven't raised any money, so you don't even expect to see the reality show happen. And some of the applicants who got accepted backed out when they had to deal with the company itself, because they said the company was playing games, was actually trying to get the applicants to pay for the flights by requiring them to buy goods. It was almost like a Ponzi scheme. So I'll leave it at that with that one. So there's lots going on here, real stuff that's happening that's really exciting, that is going to, in the next decade, especially if capitalism is allowed to function here, and competition and private enterprise, American companies are going to be doing amazing things and making possible amazing things being done in space that will really be happening. And I always like to focus on that. The stuff that isn't real, you have to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff, and this is an example of that.
Oh, and I'm certainly glad you brought that up, because that is important. I always enjoy a good conspiracy, but when the conspiracies get to be a detrimental effect, and oftentimes they do, and the internet is just like a bathroom wall on steroids. You can write anything about anyone at any time. It's just unbelievable. And you can have something that's very genuine turn into just this incredible monster that has a shape-shifting reptilian mindset. And it blows my mind out there. But there's also a lot of amazing things with the internet, and it has opened up a lot of new doors. And then you've got social media connecting with people all around the world. So yeah. I do think that that's fantastic as well. You just have to take everything with a grain of salt, no balance. But one thing that I find fascinating is I look at I need to find this in my pictures here. It's a 1995 front cover of Time magazine. It's got a picture of Mars, and it looks like it looks blue. You can see an atmosphere. You can see the poles, and now if you look at any of the pictures,
1995 an issue of Time.
Yes, 1995. Mm-hmm. And if you
look, Mars there, huh?
It's got a blue. It's not completely blue, but it's a lot bluer than it is now. Let's just put it that way. You can tell that it's got like an atmosphere around. Just Google it. Just look it up if you get a chance. And it's a 1995 Time magazine. And if you look at an image of it now, it just seems like it's a lot more red and a lot more barren, and there's nothing there. So I'm just wondering if something had happened over the past 20 years that isn't talked about much, or do you know anything about that?
All right. Well, I'm trying to get it right now to see if I can look at this myself. My first guess would be that Time magazine screwed up. Was this a global picture of the planet, or was it a picture on the surface?
Yes. Yeah, it was a global
picture. Okay. Well, all right. I can't answer the question because I don't have that cover in front of me. But no, nothing has changed. And in fact, by 1995, we pretty much knew pretty well that Mars, the red planet Mars, was the red planet Mars, and the sky had a pinkish glow, and the ground had lots of red in it because of a variety of mineral contents, a variety of things, though much of it was still unknown in 95. No, Mars hasn't specifically changed in that time frame. Mars, look, my website Behind the Black, we talk about what's separating the wheat and chaff on the web. I have to admit, one of my goals on my website is to try to do that and indicate when things are not true and when things are, and where the uncertainties are. So I spend a lot of time actually talking about Mars. I've been doing weekly rover updates outlining exactly where the rovers are traveling and where they are and what they're actually seeing, and trying to give some context in a more detailed way than NASA does it. So like when you look at a picture, a panorama that NASA releases from the various rovers, you can get an idea of exactly what it's looking at, because I link that to overhead shots from the orbiters showing where its travels had been. So you're it's looking down at a map, and then you can see the picture of what that picture took on the map, and that's helpful. And so I'm doing that kind of stuff, and then I try to pin down where they make announcements that are garbage. I'll say that's a garbage announcement. This is just public relations. They're trying to. There was a announcement a few weeks ago similar to this about Europa and maybe an ocean under Europa, and it was pure public relations by NASA to raise money, fundraising, lobbying with Congress. So I try to separate the two. Now, in terms of Mars hasn't significantly changed in the last century and a half, in the last few centuries since we've been studying it. What has changed is every time we look at it more closely, our assumptions about Mars change drastically. When in the late 1800s, when astronomers were first using good telescopes, the first ground-based good telescopes on Earth to look at Mars closely, they only saw a fuzzy disk. But what they did see was it appeared that there were features on that surface that seemed to change, and there was features that appeared to be like lines on the surface. And so there were some astronomers, Percival Lowell led the way, saying that there were canals on Mars, which means there was an alien civilization that's trying to survive on a planet that is going dry, and they're trying to find water. Well, then, in the mid-'60s, we had our first planetary flyby of Mars. And so they flew past Mars. Mariner 6 flew past Mars, and it happened to fly past Mars on the southern highlands, which has a lot of craters. And it happened to be the one strip they went across was an area where there was nothing more than there was mostly craters. And so the decision in 1964 or so, they said, Mars is like the moon. It's a dead planet. It's just got lots of craters, and it's dead, and there's no life there at all. And Percival Lowell's completely wrong, and that's the end of it. And then in 1971, Mariner 9 arrives as an orbital mission. And when it arrives, the entire planet is covered with a giant dust storm. The entire planet is, you can't see the surface. And so the orbiter, they could fortunately wait before they started to take pictures, so they just waited it out. The storm slowly subsided, global storm. As it started to subside, these peaks appeared out of the top of the storms. Big peaks. And when the storm cleared, they realized they were looking at 4 giant volcanoes, bigger than anything else in the solar system. They dwarf anything on Earth. And then they began to see gigantic valleys and canyons, bigger than anything that we have on Earth. In fact, the biggest canyon on Mars, Valles Marineris, it would cover the whole United States if it existed on the Earth. And they see what look like river flows. And suddenly, after more studying over the next few years, they realized, Mars might have had water once. So, it's not like the moon. It's not a dead planet. It might have once had water. It has no canals, though, but it had what looked like rivers. And so then they send Viking to the land on the planet in '76 with the idea we're going to find life because, it had water. And those Viking probes, it wasn't really a well-designed mission because you didn't know enough yet to really search for life. But they went and searched for life, and the results were inconclusive. But the scientists decided because they were inconclusive, they were negative. There's no life on Mars. Mars is a dead planet. That was the decision we made then. Mars is a dead planet. Mars hasn't changed yet, but you'll notice our opinion of it has changed drastically. Well, then a few decades passed, and we sent the first landers, rovers to Mars. We started to look at it again, and they looked at a rock that looked like it might have had a fossil in it. It didn't, but they thought it might. And suddenly the opinion is, well, maybe Mars did once have life, and that's what we are right now. The rovers are looking at Mars, trying to get an idea of its geology, and scientists think possibly it might have had life in the past when it was wetter. And we're talking now billions of years ago possibly, when the climate was different, the atmosphere was thicker, and therefore it was warmer, and there was the possibility then of liquid to flow on the surface. But right now, so then there could have been life then. Could some of that microscopic life have survived to today? No one knows. That's what the research is asking at this very moment.
Yeah, and absolutely. I'm looking at the 1997 March 10th image from the Hubble Space Telescope, and even this image looks incredible. I mean, you can see like a bluish, it looks like the atmosphere is kind of blue. You can see the different poles, and it does have the red continents, but man, I mean, even the images that I look at now, they don't look quite this bright and crisp, and I certainly can't wait to see what happens if they are able to terraform it at all. Did you watch the film Martian?
I haven't actually seen Martian yet, so I get the movies about usually a year or two after they come out. I like to wait to see if people are still talking about them a year or two later. So Martian I will get to see at some point. Mars as a planet is interesting. We have to always remind ourselves that it's an alien planet. It isn't like the Earth. So if it looks like it has river flows, they might seem to resemble what's on Earth, but we have to remember the gravity is about a third that of Earth. So every chemical reaction, every activity of water or materials on the surface is going to behave differently than here on Earth. And so it's an alien place, and we have to always remember that. I had a few posts recently about Curiosity. Curiosity was moving through this really spectacular region in the foothills of Mount Sharp. It's slowly climbing this mountain, and it hasn't really gotten to the mountain yet. It's in the foothills now, and it went through an area that had a series of buttes. They look like mesas. They look kind of like the mesas you'd see in the Southwest where I live. But a close look at them, and I posted images of this, a close look immediately tells you this is not like anything on Earth because of the light gravity, you have many thin layers on top of each other here that were laid down geologically, probably because there was a lake here and it would come and go, and each time it would come, it would deposit a layer of silt or mud, and then it would go away, and then it would deposit another layer of silt and mud, and so you get these thin layers on top of each other, and on Earth, when it starts to erode away, the gravity makes them fall down much faster. In Mars, you get these incredible, really weird-looking rocks, flat plates sticking out almost like they're floating because there's not enough gravity to knock them down, and there isn't much atmosphere either, nor is there's no rain, and so you get really unusual shapes, and it tells you this is an alien environment. And we have to keep that in mind at all times. It doesn't have a blue sky. The sky tends to be reddish. Right now, they think there is a dust storm with Curiosity. The dust has been building up in the atmosphere where Curiosity is. There isn't yet any dust in the atmosphere visible from Opportunity, but recent research from scientists says we're in the prime season for another global dust storm. And so over the next few weeks, we might see another global dust storm that will cover the planet. And this happens every 5 to 10 years or so, and that would be of itself quite interesting to watch from the ground.
Absolutely. And I'm having these visions of having this really cool spacesuit on, being on Mars, and with the gravity the way that you say it is, I could just jump 50 feet in the air and wouldn't have any problems, huh?
One of the reasons I love to post images taken by the two rovers and to follow their travels is because I'm a hiker. I love to go out into the great outdoors. That's why I live in the Southwest. And I look at this, and I can just imagine being able to stroll the surface here and see some really incredible, beautiful geology and beautiful terrain. And on top of it, you're right. The low gravity means you can travel. I wouldn't say faster, but it would be a totally different experience. There is, without question, if we can get cheaper rockets, and we can learn how to build interplanetary spaceships, there is an enormous tourist industry that could be developed for Mars. People will want to go just to see it. And I think that will be the foundation of that initial colonies that will be built there.
There might be more truth to Total Recall than we know.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about it. The way a business functions is it fulfills a need. And like Elon Musk has been fulfilling a need because there's been a whole satellite industry that's been desperate for cheap rockets, and he's fulfilling that need, and he's making money from it. And so similarly, there is a large number of people who would love to pay the dollars to go to the moon, to go into space, just as a tourist. And if you can provide them a safe way to do it, you can make money from it. I mean, that's exactly why Jeff Bezos built Blue Origin. This company is trying to make a suborbital rocket, New Shepard, because he figured if he can get a capsule that is reusable and safe, and people can then fly on it and pay him bucks to do that, he will make money from it. And everything points to the fact there have been more than enough market surveys that have demonstrated there is more than enough demand for such a thing to justify the expense of building such a rocket. There's money to be made there.
How long would it take right now to get to Mars?
All right, well, that's coming back to cheap rockets again and better technologies. At the moment in time, because of the technology we've got, to get to Mars, what they have to do is they have to wait till the orbits line up properly. So you basically get a good launch opportunity about every 2 years. 2016, this year in the spring, was a launch opportunity. The Europeans sent a payload to Mars. It's going. It's on its way. It's going to actually land. It's going to go into orbit and send a engineering test lander next week on October 19th. The lander is going to land, and the orbiter will go into orbit next week. So this was one launch opportunity. Then in 2018 is another launch opportunity, and then you have the same thing in 2020. We have a lander that's going to go in 2018. The Europeans have one that's going in 2020, and we also plan to do one in 2020 as well. Another rover. We're building a second rover similar to Curiosity, and we're going to send it in 2020. And every one of those missions, the orbital mechanics, it's going to take you about 6 to 8 months to get to Mars based on the orbital mechanics. Now, it is possible to shorten that time significantly, but you'd have to have a much more sophisticated and powerful and efficient engines and rocket and fuel to do that. And we're not there yet. Obviously, as I described the Raptor engine, if you can increase the power of the rocket engines by 3 times, you can then launch them into orbit and then fire them at a greater speed and possibly be able to reduce the travel time significantly. I have seen analyses by engineers that suggest that under certain circumstances, with the right engines and the right orbital mechanics, you can actually reduce the flight time to Mars to as little as 30 days if you do it right. We are not there yet, but it's possible, and it's technologically possible, and it's not actually outside the realm of reality. It's very possible.
That would just be so amazing to take a 30-day journey to Mars and then talk about a cruise, right? I mean, that takes cruising to the next level. You're cruising in the cosmos.
I would to be able to, you go to Mars, you land, there's a colony there, a resort. It's placed right on the rim of Valles Marineris, which would, like I say, pretty much cover the entire United States. The views would be spectacular, and then you can hike down to the bottom, even though it's much deeper. The gravity's 1/3, so it'd be easy. Just imagine the tourist possibilities. From a sightseeing point of view, I drool when I think about it. Similarly, on the moon, we're talking about Mars, but I think about the moon. Moon is only a couple of days away, even with the technology we've got, 3 days away, and there are some places on the moon that would be incredible to stroll about and see. Most of the Apollo missions, they landed near the equator. They landed in relatively safe terrain. The last mission near Hadley Rill was really spectacular country with big mountains and big craters and big canyons, but generally the missions were trying to be safe because it was really pushing the envelope. So the scenery wasn't spectacular, but some of the orbiter pictures that have been taken, the unmanned orbiter pictures that were taken by Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter of things like the crater Tycho and Porkinus, it's like, oh my gosh, this would be an incredible place to set up a resort and people to come and stroll the mountains there. The views are just amazing. And so, yes, I drool about that possibility. I doubt it'll happen in my lifetime, but I'm sure it's going to happen in the next sometime in this century. We will have these kind of thing going on without question. You will have colonies on these planets.
Well, let's go back for a minute to what you wrote about in Genesis, the story of Apollo 8. If I think about the possibilities of 40, 50 years worth of just serious research and development, money being funneled into this specific industry and it being on the top priority list of many politicians and corporations, just imagine now we would probably have resorts on the moon, in my opinion. And I wonder why, with the technologies and with, we sent just amazing ships out there, and what happened, then all of a sudden it just seems like we stopped and we didn't care anymore, and the funding didn't get, the funding wasn't offered to these programs. And it's kind of hard not to think that there might be some type of conspiracy involved, right?
Well, the conspiracy was a conspiracy of stupidity. It's very simple, Rex. And actually, my book, Genesis, Story of Apollo 8, it's really about the 60s space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it culminates on the Apollo 8 mission that was the first mission to leave Earth orbit. It'll always be the first time human beings left Earth orbit. It was the first time they went to the moon. They orbited the moon. They didn't land it. They orbited it during Christmas week, 1968. And while they were there on Christmas Eve, they actually read from the Old Testament to the world. And I wrote that book because this mission, my memory, I was alive at the time, and I was a teenager, so I was into space, so I was really paying attention. And I really remembered that this was a significant historical event, not so much in what happened, but how the country apparently changed culturally after that mission. And so after, I got to be an adult, I got into the science writing business, and no one had written about this mission. And I said, this is an important mission, it needs a book. And so I wrote the book. And one of the things about the 60 space race that must be understood by Americans is that this was a significant cultural competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. And the Soviet Union was based on the premise of a top-down command economy where the government dictated how things would go. And the government might have had very good intentions in trying to do the best job it could, but it was a centralized top-down system. And the way the United States functioned from its inception was bottom-up, private enterprise, privately owned, individual efforts, competing against each other, innovating. And when Kennedy said we should go to the moon, his goal was to prove that the free private capitalism system was the better way to do things. And yes, we won the race to the moon, but ironically, the way Kennedy did it was in the Soviet style. It was a program by the government to get us to the moon. And even though private enterprise built the rockets and the capsules and all the technology that got us there, it was still a government-run, top-down program. You use the word program. And the way the United States was conceived from its inception was there would be no program. It would be competitive freedom, individual people following their dreams in a chaotic, uncontrolled, wild party. Literally, just people do their dreams. They follow and they try to make things happen the way they want to happen, and no one dictates terms. There is no program. And the irony is that in the 60s, the success of the NASA space program convinced the country to become Soviet in style. And our space program for the next 40 years was Soviet in style. It was a program. Trouble is, the government really wasn't that interested in innovating, it wasn't interested in reducing costs, and it really wasn't interested in doing it. And so they would fund it, but the purpose was shifted from getting to other planets into basically providing pork within congressional districts. They could say, I'm providing jobs. Are you building a space system? No, but you're providing jobs. And so we had the shuttle, and we went around and around the Earth a lot of times, and they did a lot of good science research. They launched the Hubble Space Telescope, and they repaired it multiple times. They did a lot of good work. But when it came to actually exploring and settling the solar system, none of that happened. None at all. And the ability of NASA to come up with a new design and innovate and come up with new rockets just didn't exist. It doesn't happen because of government program. The whole point that Kennedy was making, and we actually did prove it in the 60s, is that a private enterprise and capitalism and freedom is really a better way to do things, and not a government program dictated by bureaucrats in Washington and politicians in Washington. So that's why nothing happened. So it was a conspiracy, but it's just basically a conspiracy of foolishness and in a certain sense, I'm speaking 20/20 hindsight because I lived those years, and I have to tell you that I myself didn't realize this until I wrote Genesis in the mid 90s, and suddenly started to realize, oh my gosh, we made a terrible decision in the 70s when we decided to copy the Soviet Union. It's the last thing we should have done. And what has now happened in the last decade and a half is that America is beginning to transition back to its roots when it comes to space exploration. Competitive private enterprise and capitalism and freedom is determining what we're going to do in space. We really do not know what will happen in space because it's going to be determined by the private companies that come on, and the individuals who run those companies and their dreams, plus the customers that buy their products who have their own dreams involved. And that's going to produce success. And it already is, because, and as I mentioned already, Rex, early in the show, everyone said for decades you cannot vertically land a first stage rocket and then reuse it. And we've already had two companies prove that assumption completely wrong. And they did it because they're private and competitive and following the individual dreams of their company presidents.
Yeah, that's incredible. And when stuff like that happens and so many naysayers are proven wrong, it seems like science can rewrite itself, history can rewrite itself. So I think that being open-minded to the point of having a balanced approach to things and looking for other possibilities, it seems like big science sometimes gets in its own way by only allowing certain possibilities. And it's great to see, like you said, I really appreciate how you brought up freedom and intuition, and then you've got also capitalism and other things that are kind of fueling this desire for space travel. And there's so many things that could come with this. If you have an opportunity to travel different planets and different moons, the stars, etc., then you could come up with, I'm sure, all sorts of different elements that we don't even know about now that could be used for certain things. It's just the possibilities are incredible. Now, what about some of these other planets in our solar system? We've talked about Mars. We've talked about the moon. What about some of the moons that orbit Saturn and Europa as well? And what about Phobos? I mean, that's a very strange moon also.
Well, I don't know if I do another. I've been a regular the space reporter for another radio show for now more than a decade, and we always joke about the Phobosians on Phobos. There aren't Phobosians, but the Russians have tried to land a lander on Phobos now twice, and both times it failed in a number of ways. But then the Russians have a perfect track record when it goes to trying to land on Mars and do a probe on Mars. They've done about 20 attempts, and they have a 100% failure rate. They have a curse when it comes to going to Mars. And in fact, the lander and orbiter that is arriving next week on Mars, it's a European mission partnered with the Russians. The Russians didn't build the spacecraft or the lander. The Russians provided the rocket. But it is another Mars mission in which the Russians are involved. And every single time the Russians have been involved in the past on a Mars mission and there's no exceptions to this, the mission has failed. Even if they didn't send the spacecraft, if they provided the rocket, any participation, it failed. Now, it's like a curse. They've had very bad luck here. Most of the failures occurred in the 60s and 70s when they were the Soviet Union. And it's an interesting thing. They were successful in landing on Venus, landers that were actually able to send back data for a significant amount of time. So it's not the difficulty of going to Mars that caused the failures, because going to Venus and landing a lander that can work is far more difficult. They just have had this string of bad luck like a curse. And it's not because there's aliens on Mars preventing us, because if that was the case, we wouldn't have the American missions there that have been remarkably successful. We've had very few failures in comparison. And so next week we're going to find out if the Russians can finally break that schneid and finally have a success. Now, so Phobos is an example. They've had two failures. Phobos would be interesting, but I don't think Mars, the moons of Mars, are that interesting. They're basically they look like asteroids, and that's what they are. Much more interesting are the moons around Jupiter and Saturn. You mentioned Saturn, but let's start with Jupiter. You've got the four Galilean moons. These are the moons that Galileo first discovered back in 1600. And of those moons, Io is a volcano planet. You really wouldn't want to be there unless you're a geologist. But Europa and maybe Callisto and maybe Ganymede, those three might have underground oceans. And especially Europa, there's a lot of evidence to suggest there's an underground liquid ocean there. And it's very possible in some places it's not that far from the surface. And that from a human perspective, a colonist's perspective, is intriguing, because that means you might very well be able to get, you could settle, the ability to make a colony there gets improved enormously if there's water, especially liquid water. Water, of course, we need it to drink, but water is made of hydrogen and oxygen. We need the oxygen to breathe, and hydrogen and oxygen can be used to produce fuel. And so it's a very valuable resource in space, and there might be there. Plus, it would be a spectacular place to be. Imagine you'd get up every morning and see the planet Jupiter below you. It would be just amazing. And then in Saturn, you've got Enceladus, which also has, and it has an underground ocean, and it actually has vents where we've detected water, steam coming out from them. And so that's interesting in itself. And, of course, Saturn. I post periodically images coming from the Cassini orbiter, which is now wrapping up its mission. It's only got about a year to go. And last year, they're going to be flying the spacecraft in increasingly high inclination orbits between the rings and the planet, getting close to the surface of the planet, the gas giant, but also flying inside the rings. And so the images are going to be just incredible. And imagine you're at one of them. And Cassini's now been there for more than a decade, and has provided us an incredible number of just amazing images of that ringed planet. And I once again say, if you were on one of those moons, it would be the prime resort vacation that I can imagine. And of course, you've got one of the moons of Saturn, Titan. Has a very alien environment, but it has liquid methane and ethanol, liquid methane and ethanol that functions kind of comparable to water on Earth. As a liquid, you get lakes, you get rain. But the similarity kind of ends with that phrase, because this is a smaller planet, it's low gravity, totally different chemicals working at completely different alien temperatures. We're talking about hundreds of degrees below zero. It's a very hostile environment, but it's functioning. It has an environment that has clouds and lakes and rivers and valleys and canyons and tributaries, just like similar to what you see on Earth, but produced by completely different chemicals in a different environment. And that would be in itself amazing to look at. But technologically, it's a challenge to get there at this point because it's hostile. So yeah, I would love to be able to visit any of those planets, and that's just a sampling of a few. I mean, we just New Horizon went past Pluto, first close-up view of Pluto. And we started the space age in '57, and we didn't get to Pluto until 2015, and we now have at least a close look of every planet in our solar system. And Pluto in itself told us we do not really understand what's going on. I like to point out that every time we have visited a new object in the solar system, whether it was a comet, an asteroid, a planet, a moon, a satellite, the one consistent thing we have discovered every single time is that every single one of those objects is entirely unique and different from all the other objects. None of them are the same. They're completely unique, and which is astonishing. Planets, moons, they're all different, fundamentally different. The four Galilean moons and Jupiter that I mentioned all look completely different from each other. Charon, the moon of Pluto, looks completely different from Pluto. It's like totally different. And this applies across the solar system. Every single one we've looked at has looked different, and there's been a surprise when we got a close look. And that's, to me, the wonder of the universe, that everywhere we go, we're going to see something that's going to surprise us every single time.
Absolutely. There was some incredible images of Pluto. And what do you think's past is the asteroid belt outside of Pluto?
The Kuiper Belt.
The Kuiper Belt. Okay, thank you. Now, I've seen some recent reportings on Caltech University's website about how they've discovered a whole bunch of new planets outside of the Kuiper Belt. And I'm starting to wonder, like, okay, if we can get through that, what is beyond there with these planets as well? Have you done much research on that?
Well, now, you used to, remember, you used a very, Rex, you used a touchy word there. You used planets. And, there are some scientists who say that Pluto is no longer a planet.
True.
True. And so all the objects beyond the Kuiper Belt, one at least, is almost identical in size to Pluto. And there are hints there might be several others larger than Pluto that they have not been actually identified yet. Are they planets? Well, that's getting to the definition of what a planet is. And, I just said everything is unique. I don't really think we know enough about planets yet to really come up with a reasonable definition of a planet. I've talked to planetary scientists who say unequivocally that some of the moons of Pluto and Jupiter, of Jupiter and Saturn, they're planets because they're bigger than Pluto. Some of them are as big as Mercury. And so from a scientific geological perspective, they're no different than a planet, even if they are a satellite of a gas giant. And so we don't really know what defines a planet. Now, when you get to the Kuiper Belt, this is an unknown region of the solar system. We've only really realized it existed, and there were objects out there, a lot of them, in the last 2 decades. And so we have a very weak understanding of what's there. New Horizons is on course to fly past a Kuiper Belt object in 2019. It's actually they were able to adjust the path after it flew past Pluto, and they found an object that they were able to actually be able to fly past. So we're going to get a close look at a Kuiper Belt object in about 3 years. And that will be interesting because we don't really have good idea of what Kuiper Belt objects are like. Are there larger planets out there? There might be. You're talking about an extremely alien environment because it's very low energy. The sun is so far away. There's very little heat from the sun, and so it's dark. It's cold. It's almost as cold as absolute zero. And so the geology forces there are going to be very alien and different. Like, for example, Pluto, it's super cold. It's almost like absolute zero. So what happens there is that water becomes solid. It's a solid. It doesn't exist in any form but a solid. And in fact, it becomes the bedrock of the planet. The oceans they see there, frozen oceans, glacial oceans that do move, are made of nitrogen ice, and then nitrogen forming liquid or gas periodically depending on circumstances. And we're talking about alien there. We didn't even know there would be geological activity when we arrived, and my gosh, they were astonished at the geological activity that's going on in a place with very little energy. It's so far out from the sun, but it's happening nonetheless. And so what's going to be out in the Kuiper Belt, we don't know, and it will be quite interesting. The Kuiper Belt, I don't think anyone's ever going to want to live there because it's so cold and far away from anything. People who live there will be living there to make a living, and so they would maybe be doing mining. Once again, methane is going to be maybe available out there. Methane is an important fuel for the people who live in the solar system outside of Earth. You're going to need miners to get it, and so they might be out there for that purpose. But from a tourist perspective, I think the Kuiper Belt isn't going to be a main site, the number one place to go. It's far away, it's hard to get to, it's very hostile, and it's difficult. I think people will be heading towards Mars first before anything else.
Now, if also somebody is able to travel to Mars with the technologies that are available, let's say 10 years from now, 50 years from now, anywhere in between, then that might give them a segue to jump off to another planet also. It's like they could have space stations on different planets and different moons, refuel setups, etc., right?
Yes. Once again, this all comes back to cheap rockets. If you can put payloads up into space efficiently and inexpensively and reliably, and they don't cost a lot to get up there, then it won't cost a lot to actually use them or build sophisticated things. And then you're building ships that can take you to different planets efficiently, and then you maybe be able to build things that can easily develop colonies on those planets because you can get the payloads into orbit. We have a private company already that has launched 2 space stations of its own, and it launched a test module on ISS just last year. That's Bigelow Aerospace. They built their own space modules, and they intend to build larger modules for private use to rent out to whoever wants to use them. The term they've used a lot for public relations purposes is space hotels, and yes, it could be that, but they could just as well sell the space modules they build to third world countries that want to have a space program relatively inexpensively. They don't have to build anything. They just rent Bigelow provides the station. Someone like SpaceX or other companies provide the launch vehicle. You pay the bill, and we provide the technology. And then suddenly we're making money and fulfilling a need to a new customer, and that's coming up. And so the possibilities are kind of endless right now. And the most important equation here and I say capitalism and I say private enterprise, but they're all founded on the concept of freedom. And the more freedom we give the people of the world and Americans, the more chance we're going to be able to do wondrous things in space over the next few decades.
Let's make Star Trek a reality. I love that. Now, behindtheblack.com, I would recommend our audience go there if you have a chance, if you'd like to know more about Robert, and also pick up your copy of his book. It is available today, Genesis, the Story of Apollo 8. And another thing that I think is really cool, I was hoping we could talk about just a little bit before we close out tonight. And first, I'd just like to say thank you so much for coming on the show and spending your time with us. It's been great. You do like cave explorations and stuff. You get deep into these things. It looks like you've been all over the world in some of these caves.
Yes, I have actually gone where no one has ever gone before. Captain Kirk's line, I've experienced that. I do cave exploration, I do cave mapping, and have been for like 35 plus years. Most of it I've done in the United States in a variety of places, but I've been elsewhere as well to visit caves in other parts of the world. Cave exploration is just a variation of everything else I've talked about. And in fact, I'm a science writer, and that's really a variation of the same thing as well. Humans are curious, and what we're really trying to do is see things we've never seen before. Well, you go in a cave and you dig and you map it to try to figure out where you can discover a new passage, and you find new passage and you go where no one's ever gone before, and maybe you find a room that's got really spectacular formations that no one ever saw before. You've discovered something new for the world, for yourself too. Well, if you're a scientist and you've got a mystery question like, was there liquid water on Mars? Well, that's an unknown question. Can you get that question answered? If you answer that question, you've now taken a step into the unknown that no one ever knew before and answered it. And so it's the same experience, is the same. So I look at science in the same way. I look at exploration in space. It's the same thing as exploration on the Earth. Anytime you're trying to answer a question that no one else had an answer before, and you get that answer, you've widened the horizons of the human race. And so that's my interest in caving. I mean, I've done some really cool explorations in America. I was involved for many years when I lived in the East in a project in West Virginia that has now discovered almost 70 miles of virgin passage in the last decade and a half, and I've seen a couple of miles of that and was involved in some of the discovery of that. So I've done a lot of good stuff there. It's kind of cool. It's fun. It's entertaining, and fun is an important equation here. We do this. We don't just do this to we don't try to get these questions answered just because we're scientists and we must know.
Right.
We do it because it's fun, and even the scientists, they're having a ball. The guys who control the rovers on Mars, I mean, they work really hard. It's work. They've got to get the work done. Sometimes if they don't want to do it, you still got to do it, and so that's work. But bottom line, they get to control a rover on another planet millions of miles away and decide where it's going to drill and where it's going to drive. And if that ain't fun, I don't know what is. And so that's part of the reason I do this cave exploration as well, because it's a variation of the same thing. And since I'm not a mathematician and I could never have become an astronaut, I can't do the math for the aerodynamics. I went caving instead.
Well, that's really cool. I saw this video footage of this cave in Vietnam, and it is just huge. I mean, there's an entire ecosystem in and of itself in this cave, and there's a lot of speculation on, is there a hollow Earth? And I don't necessarily think it's a hollow Earth, but I'll bet you there's a lot of stuff inside of the Earth that we don't know about yet.
Well, You
Not like dinosaurs
most
or anything,
caves
but
are located. Here you're going to get my skepticism. Most caves are located in the very upper levels of the surface, very upper levels. I mean, it's literally on the scale of the Earth. They are hardly underground at all. I actually, in doing a science article on solar neutrinos about a decade and a half ago, I got a chance to go to a solar neutrino observatory that's located in a now closed gold mine in South Dakota. That the observatory, because neutrinos want to be underground so they get as little interference from other things as possible, as deep in the Earth as possible. And so this observatory was located around 8,400 feet below the surface, which is far deeper than most caves are. And when you get that far down, the temperature starts to rise. It becomes, and you don't find many voids because the Earth, the pressure of the stuff above is starting to squeeze out any gaps. And so you get much deeper than that, and you're not going to have any voids, no caves, no hollow areas at all. And the pressure is going to start to turn the material into new chemical molecular structures that are liquid and maybe not liquid, but we just instruct crystalline structures we don't really understand. I've done articles on the center, the core of the Earth, and the geological research being done on that, and they're trying to get an understanding of what the crystalline structures of the iron core of the Earth is like, and they don't really understand it very well, because to duplicate that environment on the surface here is almost impossible. They can recreate the pressures, but they can't do the temperatures at the same time, and they're doing it in the very tiny test facilities. I'm talking about things the size of what do you call it, maybe a dime or less, and much smaller than that actually. While the core of the Earth is it's the size of a moon. Really, it's big, and so trying to understand what's down there is not easy. The caving itself, you're really basically on the surface, even though you're underground. It's the uppermost crust. From a scale perspective, if you had an apple and you were thinking about the skin, we're barely in the skin. In that case, it's hardly underground at all. Different environment entirely.
Well, I certainly appreciate you putting that into scale for us here, and it's just been an honor to speak with you. Hopefully we can stay updated with the information that you've been getting access to, and thanks for everything.
My pleasure, Rex. I'm always glad to share it. I post regularly on Behind the Black news about space and science and the rover updates, and so if people want to check it out, they can come to my website on a daily basis and see what's going on.
Well, fantastic. I'd also recommend our listeners go to leakproject.com, become a contributing member, get access to exclusive content, ad-free, subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord, and pick up your copy of Genesis, the story of Apollo 8, directly from behindtheblack.com, also available on Amazon. Have a fantastic day, everybody, and be the change you want to see. Elon Musk, Rocket, SpaceX, Falcon 9, Mars, Moon, Colonization, Spacecraft, latest, Robert Zimmerman, here at the Leak Project. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're having a fantastic day. This is Rex Bear with Leak Project, and we have guest Robert Zimmerman with us. Now, Robert is an expert in privatization of spaceflight. We get in deep into the possibilities of where rockets could be within the next 10 years. Heck, where they're even at now. The Falcon 9 rocket, how Elon Musk has literally revolutionized the industry. Now, several years ago even, not too long ago, you guys, there were just a few key players, Russians and Americans, that charged billions and billions and billions of dollars for rockets and space travel. Very limited. Now, there's over 30 companies trying to beat Elon at his own game. It used to be a rocket launch would cost anywhere from $100 million to $500 million to launch a single rocket. Elon has changed the industry to now they cost about $62 million bucks. This has given him billions in contracts. We discuss new technologies that are being used, like the Merlin engine. We also talk about new fuel sources that could be used in some of these rockets. A new engine called the Raptor that uses methane instead of kerosene. Now, one of the key reasons to use methane, Robert says, is because it will be much more readily available in space. Have you heard of Blue Origin? founded by the owner of Amazon, Jeff Bezos. This is an inner orbit rocket. Now, we talked about how long it would take to currently get to Mars. And when the orbits line up, about every 2 years, you can send a payload to Mars that'll take anywhere from 6 to 8 months. We also talked about how Russia seems to have some type of curse when landing on Mars or Phobos. They made it to Venus, but they can't land on Mars. He doesn't think this is an alien attack. He thinks that this is just a curse that they have. Who knows? The New Horizons is getting ready to fly past something beyond the Kuiper Belt. BehindTheBlack.com. Also pick up your copy of Genesis, the story of Apollo 8. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord. Become a contributing member at Leak Project. For $10, you'll get access to over 300 full-feature podcasts, downloadable, streamable, commercial-free, and your contributions greatly help Leak Project. Also, pick up your high-resolution vinyl decal for $10. Wake people up. Be the change you want to see. I'm sure you guys remember the recent SpaceX launch of the Falcon 9 rocket that blew up on the landing pad, and there was some video footage of, looks like a bird that flies past it at the same time it blows up, and some people thought that that was some type of either alien technology or other sorts of technology that caused the rocket to blow up. I watched the video footage and it just looked like a bird to me, but it could have been a really pissed off crow. Who knows?
Well, that accident that occurred on September 1st is really, it's rocket science. So things go wrong. And before we even talk about it, we should at least lay the groundwork of what's going on in the space industry right now. The rocket that exploded was the Falcon 9 rocket, which is being built by SpaceX. And that's a company that was founded by Elon Musk. And Elon Musk was one of the founders of PayPal. And he did that in the 90s as a very young man. They sold the company, and he suddenly found himself with a lot of cash on hand, and didn't know what to do with it. Well, actually, he did know what to do with it because he was always a space cadet. He wanted to go to Mars. He's always wanted to go to Mars. So he decided, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to build the first private scientific planetary mission to another planet. We'll go to Mars. And he researched, and he found with the money he had from selling PayPal, he could afford to build a spacecraft, a planetary probe that would go to Mars. But he discovered he could not afford to launch it, because the rocket industry at that time, prior to the aughts, the first decade of this century, was a very dead industry. You had about 4 or 5 companies worldwide, some of them nationalized, the Russians and in Europe, and then 2 companies in the United States that had actually formed a partnership, so there was only one company here, really. And none of them were interested in competing. They all had their little niche markets, and they were happy, like the American companies were quite happy to selling their launches to the military and to NASA and not compete for the commercial market. And the Europeans grabbed most of the commercial market, with the Russians grabbing the rest. And they were just happy not to do any innovation, any competition, not to lower prices. The people they sold to, mostly the government was their main business, was not interested in lowering the prices at all. And the commercial market was dying because no one could afford to, just like Elon Musk discovered, no one could afford the launch price. So Musk says, a light bulb went off in his head. He said, you know what? I'm a good businessman. Why don't I just simply start my own rocket company and make money, because I can undercut all these people. There's definitely you can cut the cost here, and that's what he did. And he developed the Falcon 9 rocket, and he developed a business practice that reduced the cost enormously. And the result is, and I'm talking about really enormously, a launch before Musk showed up would cost anywhere from $100 million to almost $500 million. That's for the rocket. And Musk shows up and he says, okay, and he puts it right on his webpage, our launches cost you $62 million. So almost half, even at the lowest price, he was cheaper. And that includes beating the Russians to the price as well. And the Russians have very low labor costs, so they really could have been cheaper. What happens? Within 5 years, he's got almost $1 billion in contracts. In addition to that, NASA hires him to build cargo to bring to ISS. And he develops a Dragon capsule, developed it right from the start to be manned. But it's doing cargo. And at the time, NASA decided to hire 2 companies to do this. Another company, Orbital ATK, was hired to send up its capsule as well to bring cargo to ISS. And the result is that Elon Musk's decision to compete has forced every other one of those other companies that for decades was not trying to lower prices, were not interested in innovation or creativity or trying to find a way to do this better. Suddenly, they have to find ways to cut their costs, and they have to find ways to do it creatively. One of the ways that Musk's company has really sent fire throughout the entire industry was his decision 4 years ago to make the first stage rockets of his Falcon 9 reusable. And the way to do that is to recover them, was to have them land vertically at the launch pad after launch. And everybody told him, and decades I heard this said, for decades, that that was impractical. You wouldn't have enough fuel to do it. You wouldn't be able to get your payloads into orbit. Even if you did it, the first stage wouldn't be usable again. The stress from launch would make it not workable. And he said, well, I'm going to do it. And guess what? They did it. It was historical. It was a big deal. He made history doing this. And in doing so, he demonstrated, one, that it can work. You can get your payloads into orbit even if you use the fuel to return the first stage. And you can reduce the price of launches anywhere from 10 to 30% over his already cheapest prices. Now, what that's done to the whole launch industry is that by lowering the cost, it means that companies that before could not afford to put payloads in orbit now suddenly can. And so your customer base has suddenly grown. And the result of that is that there are now about 30 companies trying to do what Elon Musk did. This is not the old players. These are new companies trying to do exactly what Elon Musk did, but beat him at his own game. And the result is a revitalized launch industry, mostly revitalized by Americans who are pushing very hard to be creative. This is really old-fashioned Yankee ingenuity. And be creative and come up with better ways to do things that will be less costly, and therefore we can accomplish more in space. And we do it with profit all along the way. Now, having laid that groundwork, we come to SpaceX's launch on September 1st. The rocket's on the launch pad. They're doing a dress rehearsal countdown. They do this routinely and have been doing this routinely since they started the Falcon 9 back almost now 8 years ago, where they do, prior to launch, a few days before launch, they do a dress rehearsal countdown where they they fuel the tanks, and they get to T-minus 0, and they fire the tanks for maybe 5 seconds, 3 seconds, and they're done. And then they know everything works, and they unfuel the rocket, and they put it back, they put it down, and they say, okay, we'll launch now on the official date a few days later. Well, in the process of fueling the rocket, when out of nowhere, it goes boom, and it explodes.